Good morning. My name is Amos. I'm one of the pastors here. We're concluding our Art of Neighboring series this week, bridging actually to next week where we'll spend the rest of the summer looking at parables. And appropriately today I'll be looking at a parable too with you. But last time I spoke 2 weeks ago, I promised that I was going to talk to you about some of the benefits of neighboring. So I'm going to do that today by telling you a little story. Again, when we were in Michigan, we were church planting, and we were just very intentional in getting to know people around us. And we had one neighbor, and I'm going to change his name to Roy, which you'll understand here in a minute. One neighbor, Roy, who's really an interesting guy. He worked in a factory all his life, a little bit crusty, very salty. The kind of guy, actually, we did this housewarming party. It wasn't a housewarming party, a neighborhood party where we brought in a bunch of people, and he goes and uses the restroom. He walks out and announces to the room, "Amos, you really need to install a poop fan." Anyway, developing a relationship with him. One day, I'm not sure why, I'm over at his house, and he takes me down into the basement. He wants to show me something. And he shows me, it's a pretty sophisticated marijuana growing operation. That's not the benefit that I'm talking about. It was just... It was an example to show you that, at some point, even though he had no church background, I don't think he ever had been to church. I don't think he probably has been to church. There was a trusting thing that happened. And he said on more than one occasion, "I believe God sent you and your wife next door to live here." And I believe that for everyone in this room as well, that where you live, the people next door, God has you there for a reason. But the benefit of neighboring, getting to that yet, it snows a lot in Michigan. In my experience, it snows more in Michigan than it does here. And the thing about in Michigan, the sun never shines, so the snow just keeps piling up and piling up and piling. It never melts, piles up. So this neighbor, Roy, whenever it would snow, he just started with his snowblower and just kept going down right to the corner, which is a big deal because we lived on a corner lot, a lot of sidewalk on this corner lot. The other neighbor would do the exact same thing. He'd get out his snowblower, just keep going right to the edge of the corner. And Allison will remember this one time. One time it snowed and snowed and snowed. It was one of those, you have to snow blow 3 or 4 times. It just wouldn't stop. It came and snow blowed our whole driveway. It was a huge blessing because I was out of town, and she was with the shovel, just tired of it. But there's other benefits of neighboring too, of course. I was at a graduation party a couple of weeks ago where all the neighbors had come over. There's a real awesome energy power there. When you know your neighbors, you drive home, you wave, you don't hide in your garage. There's just all kinds of things that when you know your neighbors, suddenly home feels more like home. But let me tell you, all these great benefits of neighboring, if it was just as easy as that, everybody would do it and everybody would know everybody in the neighborhood. The reality is sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's painful and sometimes neighbors are strange or weird or annoying and all these things. And so to neighbor the way that Jesus calls us to, we need something. We need more than just these benefits of neighboring, and we'll get into that later. We're going to look today at Luke 10. So if you have your Bible here and you want to open it to Luke 10, you can. We'll have it up on the screen as well. And before I move there, I just need to give props to Tim Keller. There's a picture of this guy. I give props to this guy occasionally, but it's partly because I have a man crush on him. Look at that face. Anyway, this is a passage, the Good Samaritan story, that I've known for a long time, since I was a little kid. Tim Keller opened this passage up to me in a new and fresh way. So even though you know the story, I hope that today there's some new, fresh perspective on it. This story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, is in the second half of Luke 10. The first half of Luke 10 is all about being gospel messengers. The second half of Luke 10 is about being gospel neighbors. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by gospel? The gospel is that Jesus came into the world for you. He lived for you. He died for you. He was raised from the dead for you. And now he sits at the right hand of God the Father in heaven for you. He came announcing his kingdom, which means that God's rule, God's reign, God's will is being done here. We look forward to a day where it's done just like it's in heaven. So he came and he met people's spiritual needs, their physical needs, their emotional needs. He offered people forgiveness. He offered them freedom from shame and from guilt. But he went beyond that. He would go around healing people from all kinds of diseases, and he would give people dignity, right? This emotional thing that people are seeking after. He would give them dignity. He would give them friendship. And we, what he started here 2,000 years ago, look forward to a time where that has come to completion, where his kingdom comes in full. Because here's the reality. Even the people that Jesus healed 2,000 years ago from these diseases, they died. And we see today still prayer that leads to healing, and then sometimes they get sick again, and eventually they will die. But we look forward to a day when Jesus returns that death will no longer be, and suffering will no longer be. Pain, mental illness, cancer, all these things will come to an end when Jesus returns. So that's what the gospel is. And to be gospel messengers means to bring that message to people. But to be gospel neighbors means that even if nobody responds to the message, we're still to love. We're to show them the gospel with our actions. We will tell them, we will show them, we will love them, no matter what. So, let's look now at Luke 10. We'll start in verse 25. Part of this is going to sound a little familiar to you from 2 weeks ago. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" So, this religious expert, think of him like a religious lawyer perhaps, comes to Jesus and asks a question. Jesus responds to that question with a question. It's a good way to respond to gotcha questions, okay? The religious lawyer answers, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus responds to that, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." These two pieces, loving God with all your heart, mind, and soul, loving your neighbor as yourself, this is very close to the core of what it means to follow Jesus. And that first piece, loving God, means that we love God so much that we are content in all circumstances because you already have what you want. That's powerful. My friends, that's amazing. Our love for God is actually a benefit to us. Because we can look for happiness in all kinds of other places. And God is teaching me a lot about this right now. There's been a couple times in my life where I've been like on the edge of meltdown. And it's when I start to have my love wander off from being God first to being perhaps career first. Most recently, we bought this house. I started placing my happiness, my love, in the house. And the house cannot bear the weight of that. Nobody's job can bear the weight of ultimate happiness. Nobody's marriage can bear that weight. No friend, no child, nothing can bear that weight except for God. So this is an incredible thing. That God says, "Love me with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength." But in doing that, you will achieve happiness that you can find nowhere else. It's good. Sounds good so far, right? Second part of that, love your neighbor as yourself. And to that, this religious lawyer wants to justify himself in verse 29. This sounds like the stakes have been risen. This sounds like work. And so he asks this question to justify himself and says, "Who is my neighbor?" To love your neighbor as yourself. This is high, high calling. You know what that means? It means that we are to meet the needs of your neighbor with all the force, speed, effort that you would meet your own needs. Most of us spend a lot of our time, if not all of our time, trying to build up ourselves, our own stuff, protecting our assets, promoting what we have, trying to seek after our own happiness, right? And this command, love your neighbor as yourself, means do all that with the same force, speed, and effort for your neighbor as you would yourself. That's huge. That's, I would dare say, impossible. And so, this religious lawyer, like any of us would, tries to whittle that down to make it more manageable. And this religious lawyer is operating off of a premise that many of us live off of too. Or can live off of. It's like the human default. It's the premise that if I am virtuous enough, if I am good enough, if I do enough good things, then God will accept me. Then he will love me. Then he will show me his favor. Right? Good American, earn it. Show me the fruit. But Jesus is going to turn this upside down, turn it on its head. And he does this by telling a story. 2 weeks ago when we looked at this in Matthew, he says the entire Old Testament hangs on these two commands. This time he's going to tell a story. And so he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So he replies by saying, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now a priest happened to be going down that same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, when he came down to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. These two guys are like really good religious, go to synagogue every week type of people. But then a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii. That's about 2 days' wages. So think like big screen TV. You buy a big screen TV with this. And gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of robbers? Now the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. In this story, in this parable, which we'll talk more about parables in a couple of weeks, we see both the magnitude of this command to love your neighbor and the motivation for which we have any hope to follow through on this command. The magnitude. We tend to limit this love your neighbor thing, and we tend to limit it in 3 ways. We want to limit the who, we want to limit the when, and we want to limit the how much. I'm going to just walk through these a second, and one of them might stand out to you as the one that you limit the most. The first who that is limited is that we tend to want to help people who are like us, and who we like, and who like us. Catch it? People we like are people like us, and we like them to like them. Those are the easy people to help. Jesus says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something radically different. And if you know something about the first century, this dynamic between the Good Samaritan and a Jewish man laying down on the side of the road is pretty incredible. I was thinking about ways to illustrate this, but like an Eagles fan walking down the street and seeing a Patriots fan bleeding doesn't quite even capture it. And this is Philadelphia, right? So if the Eagles fan helps, this is a level though, if the Eagles fan reaches out to help the Patriots fan, you're going to have other Eagles fans saying, you traitor, right? What are you doing? The Patriots fan, right? It really, to catch though the nuance, like the centuries and centuries of division and hate and oppression, I really think you have to just go back to this area. It's as if there was a Jewish man laying on the road and a Palestinian Muslim walks by. Like, this is religious, this is national, this is political, this is, you were raised to not like these people. And I'm not even going to get into all the reasons, but the division runs deep here. Jesus is saying, you got to love your neighbor, not just the people who like you and you like and are like. The second way we tend to limit the who is we like to neighbor people who will, in a sense, pay us back. I give a little, they give a little, right? But you look at this story, the guy who was half dead, bleeding on the road, doesn't give anything. He is totally passive. He is only taking in this story. He's taking money, he's taking time, he's taking hot horsepower, donkey power, whatever. And I'm not saying that you should engage in a lot of these kind of one-directional relationships. I'm just saying that Jesus calls us to engage in them sometimes, where you invite someone over for dinner, and you shovel their driveway, and you watch their kids, and you do all these things, and they take and take and take and take. Some friendships are like that, right? Where all you do is listen, and all they do is talk. Again, we don't have the capacity to only have relationships like that, but there are going to be a few of them because of the magnitude of what Jesus is saying here. The other place we tend to limit is the when. We want to make it a point to neighbor people when it's convenient, right? And that's usually how people who tell this story go with it. You know, like the Levite and the priest, they were too busy, right? So they just kept on going. But I see here that the Good Samaritan is actually busy as well, just as busy. I don't know if he was a businessman or what, but when he gets to the inn with this Jewish man, it seems that he has a place to be, because he helps him for the night, but he has business somewhere. I don't know what. I don't know. Maybe he was a camel trader. But he pays the 2 denarii and says, I'll be back, but for right now I have to go. So here's the point. He's just as busy as the other guys. But he does something that the other guys don't do. He sees the man. They all see the man, but then has pity, or really the better translation there is compassion. He has compassion on the man, and so he interrupts his schedule to help out. The other way that we limit the when is sometimes we only want to maintain a relationship, like in a Christian perspective, like this is kind of a weird Christian thing that some Christians do, if they respond to the message. Right? So I will be your neighbor, I will be your friend, I will pour into you, but that's in the hopes that you will become a Christian. And if you don't, then I'll probably move on and start loving somebody else because I've been wasting my time. This does not work. As far as we know, again, there's no response by this guy who's half dead. He's, again, totally passive. It's an act of mercy, we find out at the end. It's not an act of, if I help this half-dead man, then he will become a good Samaritan like me. The Good Samaritan gives without any, condition that there's a follow-through. So people are not projects. Do not make your relationships contingent on them responding to Jesus. Neighbor them. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not love your neighbor as yourself as long as they have a chance of becoming a Christian, okay? Okay, let's keep going. We'll get through here. We want to limit the how much. Here we have an example of there's cost involved. And there's the 2 denarii thing, yes, but then, right, the Good Samaritan says, I'll come back and pay whatever the expenses that have been racked up. There's a I will do whatever it takes kind of commitment that the Good Samaritan shows to this man. And this is tough, right? Because some of us have some nice stuff, and some of us really like to save their money. Like I'm a Dutchman, and we're known for our frugality. But there's a chance that if you loan them your wheelbarrow, it's going to come back with a scratch on it. There's a chance that if you loan them your pickup, it will come back without gas in it. What are you willing to pay to love your neighbor? What are you willing to do? How much are you willing to give? Jesus says, do what it takes. This is big. The magnitude here is huge. The second way we tend to limit, and this is maybe the biggest one, is risk. We don't want to risk. And we live in a culture that's largely fear-based. Cable news, politics, it's surrounding us all the time. And so we're afraid that our kids, if they play with the neighbors, will be influenced in a bad way, right? Anybody afraid of that? There's a fear that maybe the person living next door is an axe murderer. I don't know where that fear comes from, probably Facebook. But anyway, if you still have your Connect cards, I just want to show you something here. On the back side where it says Next Steps, it looks exactly like it did last week. So just so you know kind of what I'm looking at, we asked people to fill out these Connect cards and say one of a few things if they wanted. Whether or not they were willing to take a step toward neighboring, a barrier that I need to break through, and then there's, of course, a place there for a prayer request. And we as a staff, it was really a powerful time. We're going to do this again later because it was just so amazing. We prayed that God would help people overcome barriers and blessed the stories that we were told. So just let me read some of the barriers. They're really interesting. They're really good. One of them is my attitude, right, is a barrier toward neighboring. Another one is time. Two very common ones. Fear, 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 fear. Fear is a big one to overcome. And Jesus is going to show us here that it is possible to overcome. Jesus knows what's going on in here. He knew what we'd be thinking when he told the story, because all humans are kind of the same. We're all chicken. These two Levites, or this Levite and this priest, they see the man. They cross to the other side of the road, and they hurry on. You know why they did that? Because they're smart. They're practical. They're prudent. This is a very, very dangerous road. I have a couple of pictures just to kind of place yourself in the place. This road down to from Jerusalem to Jericho would have been known by everybody who heard the story back then. It's kind of like I-76. You avoid it going into Philadelphia as much as possible. Anyway, so it's neat. They built a modern road, as modern as that. It kind of looks like a Pennsylvania road in a way, over top the old road. So go to the next slide if you would. You got to watch out for the white American boys. Next slide. But again, so very steep, very cavernous. There's actually about a 3,000 foot going down, but there's places for people to hide. So you walk on up to a man who's half dead and not totally dead. What are you thinking? They might still be close. Whoever did that to this guy, they probably want to do it to me too. And so out of fear, I think, there are probably other reasons too, they cross over to the other side, but the Good Samaritan risks his life to help when he kneels down and picks up the man and puts him on his donkey. Where would that come from, I wonder? We're going to get into that. But before we do, you'll notice that in your bulletins there is a little map. And I told you 2 weeks ago that we were going to do this again. In your bulletin there is a map. And on that map there's a picture of your house in the middle and how many squares? 9 other squares? 8 other squares? I guess 8 other squares. And I asked you to just fill it out as much as you could. And I'm going to ask you to do that again. I'm hoping that you can fill out a little bit more today than you could 2 weeks ago. Now, you have an option. If you don't want to do that, and you didn't get a chance to fill out your Connect card from last time, I just ask that you check whether or not you're willing to take a step toward neighboring, what the barrier is, write a prayer request, whatever. Oh, and with the map, there's 3 things that we're kind of looking for, because to love your neighbor, you need to know someone's name. That's kind of baseline. How do you love someone without knowing their name? Know something about their life that you couldn't just notice from looking at the back of their SUV or their lawn, or that comes from conversation. And 3, I think to really love people, you know kind of what's deep inside of them. And I think, I have a bias here, but I think that's the spiritual thing, the journey that they're on. I'm not saying that you judge it. I'm not saying that even necessarily you're trying to convert them. I'm just wondering if you know. People often say to me, well, they know where I'm at spiritually. And I'm like, that's great. Do you know where they're at spiritually? Because I would rather there be a context for dialogue than a monologue coming from you. So anyway, you've got options. I'm going to put on a timer. If there are people who need them, could you run back and grab some extra bulletins? If you need a neighborhood map, just raise your hand and they'll come. And I'll be back in 3 minutes. Have fun. Okay, pencils down. Eyes up. How many of you were able to add something to your neighborhood map? Could I just see a show of hands? Yes. Awesome. Good job. Keep it up. Despite the fear that I think is in all of us, people are breaking through it. In fact, some of the stories here I just want to share. People are watering plants and getting the neighbor for a family while they're on vacation. I love this one. I prayed for a neighbor who has lung cancer. She is now cancer-free. My roommate and I gave gifts to everyone in our hall, taking out the trash and bringing it back up the hill. Took cupcakes to the neighbor across the street. I got the name of the mom from the bus stop. This is my favorite one. The barrier, letting people into our yard. My neighbor's story, many people walk into our yard to look at the pond in the backyard. The prayer request, that I welcome them and greet them instead of telling them this is private property. Keep out. I love it. This is so good. Oh, love your neighbors, okay. There are other arenas to neighbor people, and some of these came through on here, like people at work. Like some people shared stories about how they're neighboring people at work. Something that I witnessed last week is church on a Sunday morning is an opportunity to neighbor. So there was there was a father and a son who came in last week. And I was just talking to Dad. I'm like, I need to, find someone to meet this 11-year-old son. And so I go and find Mason Goldsmith. And I just say, hey, I want you to come meet somebody. It's his first time. He walks up and he says, hey, you're going to love it here. This church is so great. The people are amazing. It's so fun. And my jaw is like, wow, this kid. And then I look at the dad and I say, I paid him to say that. And Mason says, no, you didn't. And if you did, where's my money? Anyway, he showed this extravagant friendship. I mean, just hung out with him for the rest of the morning. It was so great. So there are opportunities here on a Sunday morning. We have new people here who are here for the first time who don't know anybody that come in. Some of them have been following Jesus their whole life. Some of them aren't following Jesus yet, and they're just exploring. There's opportunities before the service in the cafe. There's opportunities during the greeting time to neighbor someone that's near you who's sitting down because they don't know anybody. There's opportunities after the service. There's opportunities to take people to lunch. There's opportunities to invite them into your life group. There's just these incredible opportunities on a Sunday morning because something, and I believe it's God, is drawing people in because he wants relationship with them. So I'm going to land here on motivation. Why would we do this? Where do you get the power to do this? Now, there's two possible ways to live like this, two possible sources of motivation. One of them is insufficient, and the other one is completely sufficient. The first way is the way of morality. Now, this can be secular morality or religious morality. The secular version of this goes something like, I'm an enlightened person, I'm an educated person, I'm a civic person, so I will care for people around me when they are in need, especially. The religious kind is similar, but I'm going to care for people in need because the Bible tells me so, or because the Quran tells me so. The problem with both of these is that they're both guilt-based. And again, Jesus knows about this kind of motivation, and he inserts two incredibly moral people into this story to show us that it's not enough. The Levite and the priest. He could have picked any two types of people. He could have said it's a Sadducee or a Pharisee or a carpenter or anybody, but he picks the Levite and the priest. These two people had jobs, and the jobs included giving out alms, giving out money to the poor. They were incredibly moral people. They helped people all week. They're like social workers. They're huge helpers. But when it came to this, the risk was too great. The motivation wasn't enough. The guilt didn't overcome them and move them to help this man. And so if anybody is here feeling guilty because your neighborhood map sucks, just stop it. It's not going to get you very far. It'll make you like a little bit nicer and a little bit more generous and a little bit all these things. But who wants that? Don't you want a life that's radically changed? Don't you want a radically new kind of life, a radically new kind of operating and moving? Like, the guilt will not take you very far. But there's a second type of motivation. And now the key to this parable is where Jesus puts this religious lawyer. The guy asking the question, he's in the story. He could have told the story something like this. Hello, religious lawyer. There once was a man just like you. He was riding on his donkey, and he sees a Samaritan in the road. And this religious lawyer, just like you, this man just like you, had pity on him and reached down and bandaged his wounds and took him to Jericho and paid for his stuff and said, I'll pay the rest, just whatever you need. This man just like you should be more like him. Go and do likewise. What would have the religious lawyer said? What would have this Jewish man said? Are you crazy? I am not inspired. You're trying to make me feel guilty. Forget it. I'd be a traitor to my people to help this good Samaritan. But Jesus doesn't tell the story like that. He says there was a man just like you, laying in the road, bleeding to death. And so here's my question. Would you accept this radical act of grace and mercy from this Good Samaritan? You're the one that's dying. There's almost no hope for you unless this Good Samaritan, unless this unclean, hated, distrusted enemy will come down off of his steed and save you. You see, Jesus could have offered this man another rule, simply. Don't be racist. Be a nicer person. Give more money. Have people over for dinner. But he didn't offer this man another do it. He didn't offer this man another rule. He offered him a dynamic. Jesus is saying, I am offering you a dynamic relationship, an experience of radical grace. Because only if you've experienced this incredible grace will you ever start to actually love neighbors the way that I expect, or the way that I hope. Loving neighbors is not the way to life, it's the way of life. Just like the fruit on a tree doesn't give the tree life, but it's a sign that it's alive, right? Jesus offers this dynamic. Only if you've had this experience of radical grace will you start to see people differently, will you start to love them, even if there's political differences, even if there's religious differences, even if you're afraid. Only if you've had this radical experience of grace will you ever hope to overcome that fear. And notice here, Jesus is not just saying you will never be a neighbor until you have been radically neighbored. The question is, who is neighboring you? So at the beginning, right, the man asked the question, who is my neighbor? But at the end, did you see this? Jesus changes the question ever so slightly. Which of these was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Jesus is saying, this dynamic relationship is with me. And he wouldn't just risk his life to save us. He would give his life to save us. He's the one who comes down on the steed, sees us bleeding, sees us hopeless. We've made enemies out of God. We didn't deserve to be picked up, but he does. He gets down, he picks us up, he sets us on his donkey, he bandages up our wounds. Whatever it takes, he offers us as radically free grace and life-giving relationship with him. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That's like dense and hard to understand, but it means this: Jesus offers himself as our good Samaritan. It's amazing. It's beautiful. Let's pray. Jesus, you who knew no sin took on our sin. Your love for us is incredible. And I just pray that if anyone here is half dead, spiritually bleeding on the road, that you would meet them right now. If you've never said, Jesus, please help me, I invite you to do that in your heart right now. The words aren't so important. The precise language isn't so important. To just turn your heart toward Jesus, look into his face, and say, Jesus, please help me. There's a life that comes from doing that. There's questions along the way. There's sometimes years and years and years of healing that has to happen. But he's good. And the grace he shows is radical. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. You guys can stand if you would. We're going to worship a little bit. If you, for the first time today, said, Jesus, help me, I encourage you to find someone in this building, at home, on the prayer team later, and say, I made that decision today. There's something important about just getting it out into the air, like out of your mouth, from your heart to your mouth. So we're going to worship, and I'll see you in a second.